That is where we are headed this morning. If you've been with us through this study of Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezra 1-6, 7-10, the Israelites, second exile period, returned back to the land and rebuilt the temple. Hey, quick shout out, James and Janet, part of our founding members here at Hillcrest, thankful for the investment to stand on other people's shoulders that lead us to today. James, Janet, any word, any shout out that you'd have for us? Any word of encouragement?
Just very encouraging to come here and see so many people loving the Lord.
Yeah, pretty special, right? This is where we're not in a vacuum, that we're thankful for people that have come before us, and we get to continue to build on the shoulders of others faithfully gathering. And so that's what they did. They returned back and they restored these practices. They rebuilt the temple. And then we saw the second movement, Nehemiah 1-7, where they rebuilt the walls. Nehemiah was calling that. And then a couple weeks ago, Bruce talked about this to be continued. Last week, we made a turn into Nehemiah 8, starting this next section, where there's now this shift of renewal and revival anchored in the text. And you see the people respond. And so turn to Nehemiah 8 with me, and I'm going to read Nehemiah 8, 13-18, either on your iPad, your iPhone, if you have an app. Otherwise, there's a Bible in the seat back in front of you, or in the overhead bin. You could leave that closed. Just the seat back in front of you would be fine. Nehemiah 8, 13-18, and follow along as I read this continued anchoring in hearing from God through his word. On the second day, the heads of the father's house of all the people, with the priests and the Levites, came together to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. And they found it written in the law that the Lord had commanded by Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths, in these tents, during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should proclaim it and publish it in all their towns and in Jerusalem. Go out to the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees, palms, to make these tents, as it is written. So the people went out and brought them and made these tents, made these booths for themselves, each on his roof, and in their courts, and in the house of God, in the temple, and in the square at the water gate, and in the square at the gate of Ephraim. And all the assembly of those who had returned from captivity made these tents, these booths, and lived in those booths for a week, from the days of Yeshua the son of Nun to that day the people of Israel had not done so, that there was very great rejoicing. And day by day, from the first day to the last, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the feast for 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the rule. That we're shifting in Nehemiah, this renewal, this revival that Nehemiah highlights of what it looks like to live under God's word and the joy in obeying scriptures. I hope that's what we do consistently week in and week out around here. What do? We do this thing called exegesis, and that moves us to theology, that moves us to life. Like a Rachel Ray cooking show, we get into the text, we discuss it, we chop up the cucumbers, and we do an accelerated process. I'm not fully cooking the turkey in front of you, right? We put it in the oven 2 hours ago so that we're able to pull it out here. But it's like, it's not just a feast, come and eat, but it's actually come and work through this together, from exegesis to theology to life. A phrase we use around here is we want to be first-handers. We want to be self-feeders. That if you told me that Casey loves me, would I believe you? Absolutely. But how much more when I hear from Casey when she tells me, David, I love you? To hear it firsthand from her. That's what we're doing week in and week out. We long to really read so that we could really know, so that we could really live. That we long to hear from God, to read together, to dice up the cucumbers and the tomatoes so that we could really know, so that we could actually live. And so this morning, that's what we see is stirring in the people 2,500 years ago. God's people pursue God through his word, and then God's people happily act accordingly. And then God's people, on the back end of that, experience the joy in what it means to live accordingly. You heard that a little bit in Michelle's story. We're going to see that in the text this morning. That God's people pursue him through his word. Here's where we start. God reveals himself through his word, and that becomes the lens for our life. And don't read this text. You're going to see me back and forth between Nehemiah 8, 1 to 12. Don't read 13 to 18 independent from verse 1 to 12. So you're going to see a few references. You're going to see it now. That 1 to 12 is directly correlated to where we're heading this morning. It is happening concurrently. And so in Nehemiah, what do we see? Ezra told the scribe, or they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. And he read from it, and all the ears of the people, verse 3, were attentive to the book of the law. And verse 8, they read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Now we get to verse 13. And on the second day, the heads of the father's house of all the people with the priests and the Levites came together. So what's happening? They all got together. How long was the service that we read about last week? How many hours were they gathered hearing from the book of the law? 6 hours. It was a long time. We're not advocating that you guys would park your butts here for about 6 hours. That's not what we're advocating for. But 6 hours. They were enthralled. There was an eagerness, a passion. What happens now in verse 13? They all go back to work, right? I mean, people gather and they actually have harvesting to do. They actually have jobs, much like you guys. You guys actually have real jobs. You're like, David, what do you do with the rest of your week? What do you do? This is what happens. What do? Those leaders get together and they keep the party going. They continue to hear from God through his word. That's what they devote their lives to. On the second day, the heads of the father's house, all the people with the priests and Levites, came together and studied the words of the law. They continued to deepen themselves in what this meant, and they discovered something. As they read, they found that it was written. As they studied, they started to discover ideas for how God would intend for them to live. It says, as it is written. And so, we make decisions to see whether the lens that we look through in our life is through that lens of hearing from God through his word or not. I think what they were doing is still true for us. What they discovered, and forgive the crude illustration here, I couldn't find a telescope or like some kind of one of those lenses, so I just threw together some circles as it makes sense in my head. That they're looking through this lens of God through his word to inform how they live, as it is written. Sometimes what it feels like as we look around the world, much like my daughter noticed about the FedEx sign and her observation of the world around us, many operate with the grid of I am the authority. And my preferences dictate how then I live my life. Maybe formed by your experience, your context, but it's still grounded in nothing beyond just who you are. You become the authority for your life, and then you make choices based upon those preferences. Sometimes that's how the world operates. Or sometimes, for us, we continue to get a clear sense, but sometimes when we read the text, we still potentially import ourselves onto the text. We're going to see that as we continue to walk through this morning. So God's people pursue God through his word. Nehemiah says, here's the grid for how you ought to live life. And then God's people happily act accordingly. Here's what they do. And they found that it is written in the law that the Lord had commanded by Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and they should proclaim it and publish it in all their towns in Jerusalem. Go out to the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, that this is something that we should do. So what do they then encourage the people of God to do? To go do it, as it is written. So the people went out and brought them and made these tents, these booths for themselves. And so don't read this text without seeing Nehemiah 8, 9 to 12. Those should be read together. Because the question is, what's the correlation between God's direction and our action? They see it's written, and so what do? They act on it. The people went out and brought them and made these tents for themselves. And so what is that correlation? For us, I think there's a few options in the hearing and doing of the word. Here's option one. Option one would be God says it, So we do it. But what it feels like sometimes in option one is I save myself by obeying the laws of my religion. I'm simply earning my standing before God by checking a few spiritual boxes. It's God says it, so I do it, and I just hijack it almost into a way of earning, God, don't you know how good I am? And I begin following a litany of laws, whether my heart is in it or not. Option two then becomes this. God says it, and so we meditate it until we feel it, and then we do it. Now here's the challenge. You may possibly be waiting for a very, very long time that we meditate on it. I got a sense of my son meditating on some of the household chores this past week. The first thing that he said was, hey, we have some things to do. He said, I'm hungry. I said, okay, we'll get you some food. Happy to. All right, now we can do some chores. He goes, well, why don't we just wait till Mom gets home? And there was always one more reason why he needed to meditate. One of my favorite illustrations comes from Francis Chan, and he says he was telling his kids to clean their rooms. And they said, okay, Dad, we'll go do that. And then he walked in, and the room was still an absolute mess. He said, hey, what happened? I thought I told you to clean your rooms. He said, well, Dad, I've started out just praying about what I could do to clean my room. And then I invited some friends over, and we began just meditating on what it means to clean our room in the Greek. And so we thought about what that word means to clean. And then we began discussing the complexities of what it means to clean. He's like, you never actually cleaned your room. You never actually did it. So here's where option three then feels the truest sense. Option three in this sense, God says it. And so we move forward out of the affection for the glory of God. We desire to see God magnified in our life, out of the deepest delight to honor and glorify Him with our life. And yet, here's the reality. Are we there all the time? Till Jesus returns or He calls us home, we are not yet perfected. And so we're in process. So what do we do in those moments where there's this gap of my ability to actually fully, at the deepest sense, declare my affections for the glory of God in these actions? Another option, as we continue, God says it, we move forward out of the affections for the glory of God and do it. Or, in that gap, we confess a lack of affection. That God, I'm not there yet. And we pray that God might reveal and stir that in our hearts. And then from that place, move forward as an expression of faith and hope for what God might do. If someone says, hey, David, I don't really feel like reading my Bible, I say, then don't do it. But ask why. Why, if I believe this is true, why am I not there in this place right now? And then pray for that affection to be stirred, and then as an expression of faith and hope in that, move forward. There's the connection between hearing and doing. Because you might not see that as clearly in the connection as it is written, and then they acted. Don't miss Nehemiah 8, 9 to 12, that there was a stirring in their heart that produced the action. Here's Nehemiah 8, 9 to 12. Here's what started to stir in their hearts. This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep, for all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, go your way, eat the fat, and drink sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy. They started to understand more who God was, understand who they were, but don't be grieved. Don't stay in a failure of weeping. Instead, do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. And so the Levites calmed all the people, saying, be quiet, for this day is holy. Do not be grieved. And as their hearts began to shift, all the people went their way to eat and drink and send portions and to make great rejoicings because they had understood the words. So as it is written, and their hearts started to change, so the people went out and brought them and made these tents, this festival. And you still might be wondering, what in the world is a festival of booze? We'll get there in a second. For all you Bible nerds, we'll talk through that in a second. But here's the sense we should get. We have this grid. There is a correlation between God's direction and our action, and our ongoing spiritual transformation begins to get lived out from the inside out. From our head to our heart to our behaviors. that we have this truth and experience like you heard Michelle describe, these facts and feelings that begin to change our life. And yet what it feels like sometimes is we skip out on the heart. What we notice in Nehemiah 2,500 years ago, that was not the case. They did not simply skip over. Test this, but this is how I'm reading it. As it is written, so the people went out and brought them and made these tents for themselves, each on his own roof, in the courts and in the courts of the house of God, and in the square of the water gate, the square of the gate of Ephraim, and all the assembly of those who had returned from captivity made these tents, made these booths, and lived in them for a week. From when? For from the days of Yeshua the son of Nun to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. Had they not participated in this particular feast? I think they had. We read about it in Ezra 3:4. Ezra 3:4, they had already been participating in this. Ezra 3:4, and they kept the Feast of Booths as is written and offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule. So in what way hadn't they been participating in this since those days? I don't think their heart was as fully engaged. They had been going through the motions, but they hadn't actually had their hearts stirred with why this practice mattered. The head, the heart, and the behaviors. The emotions for us are simply the dashboards of faith. They're the idiot lights of faith. Our emotions tell us something. Happiness is not a good or bad emotion. It's simply an emotion. The question is, what is that emotion tied to? Sadness in and of itself is not a good or bad emotion. It's an emotion. It's an idiot light. Casey's engine light came on this past week, and it got her attention. And so what did that do? Got my attention. And so when we were talking on the phone, is it blinking or is it just a static light? She said, it's just a static light. I said, oh, just keep driving and we'll call some wonderful mechanics who can maybe help us out. They tell us something about our life. And so God's people pursue God through his word. There's the grid we enter in on life. And then when we read something, maybe for the first time, maybe something's new and hits us or something we've heard before, we then act accordingly. And then there's a promise that God's people experience joy in living the way God intended life to be lived. And so here's the text. So the people went out, verse 16, and brought them, and they made booths. Pick it up. And all the assembly of those that had returned from captivity, for from the days of Yeshua the son of Nun to the days of the people of Israel had not done so. And there was very great rejoicing. That this feast wasn't just a feast. Here, definite article, the feast. This is where they rallied, and there was extreme rejoicing at the reality of what had taken place. And day by day, from the first day to the last, he read from the book of the law, and they kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the rule. So Nehemiah starts with the big lens. Over and over and over, rather than getting to what we might perceive as the idea of what's changed their heart, he over and over and over, I think, tries to give us this grid on life. He starts with the big lens. Over and over and over, he continually says they read the law of God, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and it produced this joy and grieving in their heart that then led them to obey. Over and over, he keeps referencing the law. We're asking why. Why does he say the law instead of the specific issue that they're changing over, this festival of booths? And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses. And he read from it, and all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Verse 7 and 8. And they brought in people who helped understand the law, and they read from the book, the law of God. And then in verse 14, as it is written in the law, what is he doing? I think what he's doing is just trying to give us a big lens. This is the grid that we ought to have on life. We don't sit on the throne of our hearts. Instead, we ask God to reveal himself and then act accordingly. That God, through his word, determines the actions we take, rather than I am my own authority with my preferences. But then, in his application, he moves to a specific example. Nehemiah uses the small lens then and starts pressing into the specific action they took, which was this festival of booths, this festival of tents. So we're asking, what was that specific example intended to bring to light? And they found it written in the law that the people of Israel should dwell in booths. And so for you Bible nerds, I just want to do a small little excursus, because you might be sitting there going, what in the world is the festival of booths? Like, what in the world is happening? It is a head to a heart to a behaviors movement. In the Jewish calendar, they got 7 feasts. Passover, which we are going to celebrate here at Easter fairly soon. Unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, that might sound familiar. And those first 3 happen in the spring, or first 4 happen in the spring, and these last 3 happen in the fall. Trumpets, we heard about that recently in Nehemiah. Atonement, and this festival of booths or tabernacles, all found in Leviticus 23, and you could read about what each of those would look like for them. That in the spring, there was a planting season and festivals that were connected to God's provision in that for different reasons. And then we see that expressed, again, first month on the 14th, 15th, 16th day, and then Pentecost. Can you think of Jesus' death, burial, resurrection? You can maybe see the correlation between Israel's feasts and the life of the church. And then Pentecost, what happens in Acts, and then things that have yet to happen, trumpets, Day of Atonement, tabernacles. This is in the fall. This is the harvesting season. These are incredible feasts. This is celebrating. This is, hey, we just got a wonderful, gracious amount of food. Let's celebrate. And so those are happening in the 7th month on the 1st, 10th, and 15th day. I talked to my dad about this. This is a wonderful thing. He taught a class on this stuff. If you want more, I'm happy to send you the link to his stuff. He would love to geek out with you over any of this stuff. But then there's 2 other feasts that got added. Hanukkah, and then the Feast of Purim. We read about that in Esther. Hanukkah is a celebration of the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem following the defilement of the Greeks in that 2nd century, known as the Festival of Lights. Maybe if you've ever heard the Adam Sandler Hanukkah song, that Festival of Lights phrase might sound familiar. And then the Feast of Purim, celebrating the survival of the Jews who were marked for death by their Persian rulers in Esther. We remember studying God's provision in Esther. And so what is then the Feast of Booths? They were rescued from Egypt. They wandered the desert for 40 years, and God delivered the Israelite people. And so they celebrate that reality. They celebrate God's provision through this act, this behavior. So I want to read Leviticus 23 that is filling out this festival of booths. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, and of the 7th day is the feast of booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. As a solemn assembly, you shall not do any ordinary work. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord 7 days. A lot of rejoicing, a lot of celebrating. On the first day of a solemn rest, and the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day of the fruit of a splendid trees, branches of palms, boughs, leafy trees, palms, willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days of the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in tents, booths, for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in these tents. Why? To remind us. To remind you and your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in these tents when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I am the Lord your God. What is this festival of booths? What is this festival of tents? It was a time of celebration where the Israelites rejoiced in God's continued provision for them in the current harvest and remembered his provision and protection during those 40 years when they wandered. They remembered who God was and rescuing them from Egypt. It stirred in their heart a sense that they would dwell in these booths to remind them that God delivered them out of the land of Egypt and to look forward to the coming Messiah who would deliver his people from the bondage of sin. He rescued them from Egypt, demonstrating and stirring a heart that God does provide, leading them to action. That he's the creator, not the creature. And he provided supernaturally both provision and protection. Does that ring true for us? Now, I was out for a walk the other day. What's this thing called right here? The tendon. What's this part of the back of your knee called? What is this called? You got like your ACL. Was it ACL, MCL, something here, meniscus? What's the one back here? Dave? Biceps femoris. There you go. So I was out for a brisk walk the other day, and it's like supposed to like keep you from hyperextending your knee, right? And I was out for a brisk walk and maybe had strained it a little bit more, and it was a reminder of this failing body. It was a reminder that there are challenges in this life, and yet the question is, does God still provide in the midst of this decaying tent? Sometimes when there's vocational challenges or financial tension or challenges, we might ask and stir, is God really present? Is his provision and protection really taking place in my life? And then do I act accordingly or no? Do I wrestle with whether that's true or not? And so they practiced this festival to remind them they were rescued from Egypt and they rejoiced in God's provision. When we look around our life and we sit in that, do we hear and experience God's provision and have that lead to how we act in this life? Or am I my authority, and when God isn't providing in the way that I might deem the way I'd like to see it, I question, is that really true? That's the example that we see in the text. Their town, God provided for his people and protected them for 40 years as they wandered in the wilderness before they entered the promised land. Our town, God protects and provides for us as we go through life in the wilderness of this world while our hearts long for eternity. When I feel that pain, it reminds me that there is something that I long for beyond this life, that he preserves us as we await his return and the redemption of our bodies, that he is providing for us and we look to trust him more. There's another situation, though, that stirs for me. Like you heard Michelle say, could be limitless examples. We have a variety of ways we can experience the joy and obedience. One that always strikes me comes from James 1. James says this, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let its steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." I hear God describe through James what it looks like to trust him. How do I know when I'm meeting trials of various kinds? There's usually pain associated with that. And yet he offers a lens on how to view the pain I'm experiencing in life. His words, count it all joy. Because you know the testing of your faith produces a steadfastness, a growth that God is completing you. And yet when I look at the challenges of life, do I feel joy as I'm going through those all the time? No. So my temptation would be, if he says count it all joy and I'm not experiencing joy, therefore, through my authority, my grid, since I'm not experiencing that, therefore that can't be what the text means. Versus, God is revealing something on how his people ought to live, and then we use that as a grid for how we continue to move forward. That God's purpose is something for us in the midst of those challenges. That we have a grid and a lens on how to live life, and there is the opportunity to experience joy in the midst of those. And so I desire to reflect in head and heart, in my demeanor and actions and decisions, this growing sense of what it looks like to count it all joy when we meet trials of various kinds. For you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let a steadfastness have its full effect. You're complete and lacking nothing. What I love about this section in Ezra and Nehemiah, there is a disruption that happens. What is the disruption? They read the text and they learn something and it alters their life. Around here, we pray for those types of disruptions. We pray, God, what are you inviting me into today? What is that? It's a prayer of disruption that God would actually enter in to where we're at, revealing himself in the midst of our situation. And so, what would it look like this week to pray with more boldness? God, what are you inviting me into today? Believing he might be stirring something in our lives. And then you heard a desire to hear the word, fight for our joy, though we might not be there all the time, a fight for joy. Now I understand what the fight is, and then act. You heard 3 examples of wherever you might be. You heard Michelle describe the possibility that we're just feeling a weight of anxiousness in our life. Maybe this week you sit in Philippians 4 a little bit more of what it means to hear the word of what Paul says in Philippians 4 and to see that peace marinate in our life in the midst of whatever anxiousness might be weighing in on us. Maybe you heard the word, and this morning, Nehemiah is pressing into provision. Maybe it's an opportunity to fight for the joy that God is providing for us, and so we act with more confidence and trust that he has been working for our good. Or the third possibility, what would it look like in the midst of whatever suffering? Because sometimes that FedEx arrow is hard to see. Why? I just always assume you're in one of 3 places. You're either currently in some type of suffering that is making it hard to see what was once maybe obvious. 2, you're either just coming out of one of those challenging circumstances. Or 3, guess what might be waiting just around the corner? Maybe there's an opportunity to hear the word and fight for joy in the midst of suffering. But possibly you're in none of that. Maybe your just life is on cloud 9. I'm going to invite the worship team up. Maybe then for you, it's a desire to lift your eyes and increasingly live as living proof of a loving God to a watching world, that you would pray, watch, and step for how God might be using you in the lives around you. May I pray that over us as we continue in worship. God, you are so good. Thank you for who you are, the transformative work you are doing in our life, to hear the word and then act accordingly. Continue to draw our affections more and more to you, that we would live more for your glory and the joy you are making available for us. Thank you, Jesus.